In the spring of 1951, the Korean peninsula was a place of devastation and uncertainty. The Korean War had been raging for nearly a year, and United Nations forces, alongside American troops, were pushing northward against waves of Chinese reinforcements. Cities had been captured and lost again, villages emptied of their people, and soldiers found themselves in constant firefights amid the brutal mountains of North Korea. Among these soldiers was a young infantryman, Private First Class Francis P. Wall. He belonged to the 25th Infantry Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company. In March of that year, his unit was stationed near the town of Chorwon, roughly 60 miles north of Seoul. The area, surrounded by jagged ridges and deep valleys, was known on military maps as the Iron Triangle, a region infamous for its strategic importance and the sheer intensity of combat fought there. That month, Francis and his company were preparing to bombard a nearby Korean village with artillery. Civilians had already been evacuated, and the soldiers were dug in on the slope of a mountain overlooking the settlement. Night had fallen, and artillery shells burst in the air, streaking the sky with sudden flashes of light. The rumble of distant guns echoed across the ridges. It was then, during this bombardment, that something completely unexplainable appeared. Out of the darkness to their right, descending slowly from the mountainside, a strange glowing sphere emerged. It was large, round, and bathed in an orange light. At first, some soldiers mistook it for a lantern drifting down from the ridgeline, or perhaps some bizarre enemy flare. But as it moved with unnatural precision, weaving between artillery bursts, their unease grew. The object hovered above the targeted village, darting in and out of the explosions as if completely unaffected by the shells bursting around it. What struck Francis most was that it seemed deliberate. The object moved straight into the heart of artillery blasts, as though predicting where each explosion would occur. Yet, no matter how violent the detonations, the glowing sphere remained untouched. It danced effortlessly in the sky for nearly an hour, defying every law of physics the soldiers understood. Then, without warning, it changed direction. The glowing craft rose higher and began drifting toward the company's position on the mountainside. As it drew closer, its orange hue shifted to a brilliant blue-green light, pulsing with an otherworldly glow. The men froze. No one had ever seen anything like it. Francis, his rifle at the ready, turned to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Evans, and requested permission to fire. The lieutenant hesitated but eventually gave the order. Francis raised his M1 rifle, loaded with armor-piercing rounds and aimed at the hovering orb. He fired. The sound of the bullet striking metal echoed through the night. Unlike the artillery shells that had done nothing, his shot made direct contact. Whatever this craft was, it had a solid surface, metallic, impenetrable, yet real. For one instant, Francis felt he had actually wounded it. But then everything changed. As if in response, the object suddenly began to shake violently. Its lights flickered on and off, erratically flashing between brilliance and darkness. The craft swayed from side to side, and for the first time, it emitted sound, a deep mechanical rumble like the roar of a diesel locomotive winding up its engine. The soldiers watched, stunned, as the machine recovered from the impact. Then came the counterattack. From the craft burst a beam of light unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. It swept across them in pulsing waves, like a spotlight searching the ground. But this was no ordinary beam. When it struck a soldier, it produced an immediate burning sensation as if fire were crawling beneath the skin. The men shouted in panic, feeling their bodies pricked and seared by an invisible force that penetrated straight through them. Lieutenant Evans barked orders for the soldiers to retreat into their dugout bunkers. Francis and his comrades scrambled, underground, peering out of firing slits as the glowing craft loomed above them. Its strange beams continued sweeping the hillside, bathing everything in its unnatural light. For a terrifying stretch of time, the men thought it might destroy them all, and then just as suddenly it ended. The craft tilted at a sharp 45-degree angle and shot skyward, vanishing into the night with blinding speed. Within seconds, it was gone. The battlefield returned to silence, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery and the labored breathing of terrified men. At first, Francis and the others thought the ordeal was over. But within days, the real consequences began. Roughly 3 days after the encounter, the entire company fell mysteriously ill. Soldiers became too weak to walk and had to be evacuated by ambulance. Roads cut into the mountains just to carry them out. Symptoms included severe nausea, diarrhea, disorientation, and crushing fatigue. Doctors who examined them noted abnormally high white blood cell counts, something they could not explain. Francis himself suffered greatly. In the weeks following the incident, he endured blinding headaches, unrelenting thirst, and a complete loss of appetite. His body weight dropped dramatically, from 180 pounds to just 138. Even after returning home, these ailments persisted throughout his life. Migraines would strike without warning, sometimes forcing him out of work and into hospitals. Memory lapses haunted him, including one period where he could not recall 3 entire days of his life. To Francis, these lingering conditions could only be traced back to that night in Korea. The burning sensation from the strange beam, the sudden illness of his unit, and the medical anomalies all resembled symptoms of radiation exposure. But in 1951, no one in the Army dared write such things down. Daily reports were required of every company, but Francis and his comrades debated whether to mention the encounter. Fearful of being ridiculed or even institutionalized, they decided to keep quiet. At that time, the very concept of a UFO was not yet part of military language. To admit such a story risked ending their careers and reputations. So the incident remained buried in silence. Years later, when Francis finally told his story, he insisted it was the truth. This is what happened. So help me God. As extraordinary as Francis's story sounds, it was not the only unexplained encounter in Korea that spring. On the night of March 10, 1951, around the same time as Francis's ordeal, a B-29 bomber crew flying southwest of Cheonampo, Korea, reported a bizarre sighting. At an altitude of 17,000 feet, the crew witnessed a flash of light at their 9 o'clock position. At first, the scanner thought it was a flare, but instead of falling, the object hovered, glowing reddish-yellow, before bursting into a bluish-white brilliance. The glowing sphere, described as the size of a basketball, kept pace with the aircraft before vanishing into the night. Multiple crew members confirmed the sighting, including the tail gunner, bombardier, and pilot. None could identify what it was. The Air Force filed it as unidentified in its official records. This raised a haunting possibility. Was this the same object that had attacked Francis's company on the ground, now ascending into the skies? The timelines and locations seemed to align. If so, the object was not only capable of withstanding artillery fire, but also of soaring into the upper atmosphere at incredible speed. Such reports were not isolated. Throughout the Korean War, more than 40 cases of unidentified aerial phenomena were recorded by American and Allied forces. Pilots, radar operators, sailors, and infantrymen all described luminous objects that defied conventional explanation. With sightings accumulating not only in Korea but also across American military installations at home, pressure mounted for an official investigation. In March 1952, less than a year after Francis's encounter, the United States Air Force established Project Blue Book, a classified program tasked with cataloging and analyzing UFO sightings. While most cases were dismissed as weather balloons, flares, or aircraft, a small percentage remained unexplained. Francis's account, though never officially filed at the time, became one of the many stories that fueled growing suspicion that something beyond human technology was intruding upon military operations. Decades later, in March of 1981, a chillingly similar incident occurred thousands of miles away in the United States. In the early morning hours near the Columbia River north of Portland, Oregon, Sergeant Russell Yoakum of the St. Helens Police Department noticed a strange light moving across the sky. At first, he assumed it was an aircraft heading toward the airport. But the brightness was overwhelming, flooding the riverbanks as if the sun were rising prematurely. Other officers joined him, along with civilians on the Washington side of the river. They reported not only seeing the light, but also hearing a strange mechanical roar accompanied by a screeching metallic sound. The noise was unlike any conventional aircraft. The officers recorded their observations via radio, capturing the eerie sound as the object pulsed in the night sky. Suddenly, a thick fog rolled in, cloaking the river. The object vanished, and, when the fog lifted minutes later, the sky was clear. To the astonishment of investigators, the Coast Guard confirmed the object had been tracked on radar. Portland's airport also admitted radar contact, only to retract the statement minutes later. What haunted many was the sound, a heavy engine-like roar, identical to what Francis and his men had reported in Korea 30 years earlier. Two different encounters 3 decades apart describing the same inexplicable phenomenon. And Francis never forgot that night in Korea. After the war, he returned to North Carolina, carrying both the scars of battle and the unanswered questions of his encounter. He retired young, at just 42, plagued by poor health and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Airplanes and loud machinery could trigger flashbacks. His daughter recalled how he once mistook family members for enemy soldiers and forced them to the ground in panic. Yet through all his struggles, Francis told and retold his story. His memory of the UFO never changed, never wavered, no matter how much time passed. He believed with certainty that what he saw was real, and not of this world. Skeptics argue that the incident could have been a hallucination, the product of combat stress and exhaustion. But how does one explain the physical illness that afflicted the entire company, the abnormal blood tests, the consistency of the account decades later? Francis died in 1999, never receiving answers. But his story remains one of the most compelling and disturbing UFO encounters of the Korean War. The tale of Private First Class Francis P. Wall forces us to confront a difficult question. What did soldiers truly witness in those dark Korean skies? Were they victims of mass delusion? Or were they among the first human beings to engage with something far beyond our understanding? The Korean War produced countless tragedies, but buried within its chaos are strange moments that blur the line between history and the unexplainable. Encounters like Francis's are not isolated. They are part of a larger pattern that stretches across decades, continents, and conflicts. Perhaps this is why the Air Force launched Project Blue Book. Perhaps this is why even today governments remain hesitant to fully disclose what they know. For Francis, the answer was simple. When asked what he thought the craft was, he replied without hesitation, "An alien spacecraft, nothing like I had ever seen before." Whether we believe him or not, his testimony endures, an echo from the fog of war, a mystery still unsolved, a warning that perhaps we are not as alone as we think.